Jonagold, Mutsu, Melrose, Grabenstein, Transparent, Akane, King, Summer Red, Spartan, Discovery, Lodi, and Alkmaar. Even if you grew up in the Pacific Northwest like I did, there's a good chance you wouldn't know what these names refer to. So what are they? The apple varieties that one of my childhood neighbors' dad grew on a few-acre orchard behind their house. We had Grabenstein and King apples, along with pears and plums and berries in my own yard. The apple has long been associated with Washington in American culture, and today it grows nearly 70% of the nation's apples, but it was not always so. Welcome to Writing Westward. This month we speak with historian Amanda Van Lanen about her book, The Washington Apple: Orchards and the Development of Industrial Agriculture. It turns out that Washington's apple dominance was anything but natural, and rather the product of intensive irrigation, infrastructure projects, science, and marketing. It's a deliciously complicated story. Thanks for listening. For new listeners, here's a brief introduction to the podcast and myself. Writing Westward is supported by the Charles Redd Center for Western Studies at Brigham Young University, where I, Brennan Rensink, serve as Associate Director and I'm a Professor of History. For better or worse, this podcast is a one-man operation. I'm the host, producer, sound engineer, and everything else, all roles for which I have zero training. But I am passionate about the North American West, and I'll take just about any excuse to read more books and talk to interesting people who are writing about the region. Each episode features a conversation with them, historians, journalists, novelists, poets, scientists, sociologists, and others. The goal of these exchanges is to spark your curiosity, to think more deeply about the region, its lands and environments, and the histories and experiences of the people who have called it home. If a guest intrigues you, you can find links to their work in the show notes or at writingwestward.org. And if you have a moment, please subscribe and leave reviews wherever you get your podcasts. Share links with friends. Follow us on Facebook and X or Twitter, and send in feedback. At the end of this episode, I'll include some more information about my own scholarship and about the Redd Center, our programming and projects, and funding opportunities that you could apply for. That's right, we may want to give you money. And with that, let me introduce who we are talking to this month and why. Amanda L. Van Lanen is Professor of History and Humanities Division Chair at Lewis Clark State College. A historian of the American West, agriculture, and the environment, you can follow her regular blog postings at historyreheated.com. The site's tagline, "Cookbooks, Stories, and Recipes from the Back of the Fridge," hints at, but does not fully capture the complexity of the cultural food history stories she explores. This month, we're talking with Van Lanen about her book, The Washington Apple: Orchards and the Development of Industrial Agriculture, published by Oklahoma University Press in 2022. In this book, Van Lanen does not simply narrate the history of how apples came to Washington state, but the turbulent process by which that segment of the agricultural sector grew and evolved from small individual family orchards to hyper-industrialized and consolidated affairs. Along the way, Van Lanen demonstrates the multiple ways in which the apple was not naturally destined to dominate regional economies, nor that Washington would come to dominate national apple production. Instead, she shows how it took intense decades of infrastructure building, irrigation projects, railroads, marketing, cooperative organizations, scientific research, and more. It is an excellent reminder that we shouldn't take present conditions in the West as the inevitable outcomes of history. The apple has become a symbol of the state, but only because generations worked hard to make it so. This is the kind of critical eye and historical thinking that we should apply more regularly around the American West, investigating the decisions made that got us to where we are, and by so doing, better understanding the many crossroads the West now stands at, and the current decision-making that serves as inflection points for where our futures will lead. Professor Amanda Van Lanen, welcome to Writing Westward.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
I think in a few previous episodes, I admitted that I had picked a book because it was a pet topic or I was indulging my personal interests. All of these are of personal interest, but this definitely goes into that category. I'm a big fan of Washington and of apples. Tell us a little bit about your history and how you came to be interested in agricultural history, Washington history, apple history.
Well, my parents were missionaries, so I kind of grew up all over. And when I was in high school, we lived in Saipan, which is near Guam, little island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. And the only apples we had were those red delicious apples, and I'm sure everyone has had this experience. You bite into it, and it's like biting into a piece of wet cardboard. And I never understood why the adults in my life who had grown up in the Northwest thought that apples were so spectacular, because the only ones I had ever had were those nasty grocery store apples. At the same time, it's pretty remarkable that we had apples in our grocery store in the middle of the Pacific Ocean all year round. So when I did move back to Washington after college, and finally had apples fresh out of the orchard, it was a revelation. I got it. Like, this is why people love them. They're fantastic. Um, but that really kind of led me down the path of like, well, how did we get to this point where there's this disconnect between this delicious apple that I'm getting from an orchard and the ones in our grocery store, and just kind of the technological marvel of even having fruit available in far-flung places year round, even though it's not the best tasting. So that kind of led me down the path to start this research.
Yeah, the Red Delicious is not doing Washington any favors, I don't think,
It
in terms
hasn't
of
been for a long
reputation.
time.
Yeah, I mean, just the other day my wife bought a couple watermelons, and I'm like, watermelons in February. I don't know how great these are going to be, and they were not great. A little out of season.
Yeah. But at the same time, watermelons in February, right? How cool is that?
But that's the point, is we're buying bananas and citrus, and I mean, it's pretty wild, these global supply chains and agricultural markets. You can get anything almost anywhere.
Mhm.
So when you got to grad school, then, what turned you towards agricultural history? Was it the apple itself, or is that something you kind of came back around to during your studies?
It's something I came back around to. I actually did my master's thesis on irrigation. My dad's family, being from the West, my grandma retired to Yuma, Arizona, and it just always boggled my mind how many swimming pools are in that town in the middle of the desert. And so I was first kind of interested in water and looking at irrigation. And as I was going into my PhD program, I was chatting with one of my professors, and he's like, "Well, what about all the things that they grow with the water? What about the apples that were being grown by the irrigation projects you've already studied?" And I was like, "Oh, surely someone has written the book on Washington apples." And it turns out no one had. So I started down that path at that point.
I know it's always great when we find these topics that we cannot believe that no one has done a recent study on it.
Yeah, I hadn't even
Uh,
considered it because it's the biggest crop in Washington state. It's a $2 billion a year industry. Washington has been the top apple producing state in the nation since the 1920s. I thought for sure someone had already done a deep dive on this.
Well, like, kind of speaking of what people have written, how generally, for our listeners, I don't think we've done much agricultural history. I'm trying to think back over the last few years. How does agricultural history kind of fit into how historians think about the West and some of the work we do? I mean, you've already mentioned this connection with irrigation, so there's obviously a connection with kind of industry and infrastructure and so forth. But how else does ag history kind of generally fit into things?
I think as far as Western history goes, a lot of it intersects with environmental history. And so, like, a lot of the work coming out of California, for example, really does intersect with that environmental piece. How is agriculture changing the environment? Um, how are people kind of molding or understanding the space that they live in connection with those crops? And I think that's really where we see the biggest intersection between agriculture and Western history is in that environmental arena.
It seems like agriculture for many people, especially suburbanites and urbanites, which the majority of Westerners are, has kind of faded into the background and is thought of maybe as something that their grandparents were engaged in. And even when we're driving around, we see it on the landscape, but we don't tend to think about it very much, I don't think. People in those rural areas probably do think about it quite a lot. But it's something that was really foundational to the development of the West, but continues to be as well. What about Washington specifically? I grew up in Washington, but on the other side of the state where it's a lot greener. And, growing up, we had, I mean, you name the fruit and someone was growing it in our neighborhood. Just everything grows effortlessly, it seems, right? And I think that's what a lot of people have in their head when they think of Washington. Evergreens, the ocean, an endless bounty of, berries and apples and so forth. That's not the landscape you're talking about.
No, no. In fact, the primary apple producing regions in Washington are on the east side of the Cascades, directly in the rain shadow, and they get less than 10 inches of rain a year.
Can you put that into perspective? I
Um,
don't mean to call you out and like having memorized like rainfall averages, but what does 10 inches a year mean?
it's a very dry desert land. So compared to say where you grew up on the west side, that gets probably closer to 60 to 80 inches of rain a year. It's quite a difference. And so the plants that grow naturally are sages, bunch grasses. Um, Trees are not something that are really a part of this natural landscape. It is very arid.
Yeah, and you see it when you drive over the Cascades, the amount of kind of ferns and undergrowth in the
Mhm.
forest. Right as you go over one of the passes, it really clears out and things get dry real fast.
Real fast.
What about the climate and ecology? This then does not, I think, to the uninitiated, sound like a good place to start an apple empire, right? In a landscape that on its own cannot really support. So, like, what are the advantages of that location then? Like, why were they drawn there?
So the soils are really incredibly fertile. These are all soils that have been enriched by volcanic rock over the years. And so if you can get water on the soils, things grow incredibly well. Even still today, the Yakima Valley not only grows a lot of apples, they grow most of the nation's hops. They grow peaches and pears and cherries and just a whole variety of things that really thrive in those rich volcanic soils. Um, for fruit trees, the climate kind of hits that sweet spot where you have enough frost-free days to grow a crop, even though Washington's fairly far north. Um, Summers can get warm, but they're not too bad. Crops can tolerate it. So temperature-wise, the soil, all of those factors contribute to making this a good place to grow. The only thing really lacking was water.
I mean, we'll get to it. They come up with solutions for that. And as you say, still today, I think Washington is not far behind Idaho with potatoes, although that's a little bit farther east. Washington, not so much central, I think.
Well, they do grow a fair number of potatoes in central Washington
Central,
these days. Yeah, and Washington is right up there, right behind Idaho.
yeah.
Depending on the year, they pass Idaho, but I try not to mention that too loudly because I work in Idaho.
Yeah, and like, I had a roommate from Eastern Washington whose parents grew onions and potatoes, and he was always insistent that no, 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 Washington actually grows more potatoes than Idaho, but lots of onions and all kinds of stuff. I remember one
Mhm.
time driving. There's peppermint fields or something, and you could kind of smell it in the air.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's everything grows up there. So if that's kind of the Washington landscape, like maybe we need to get into a little bit of botany with apples. This is a little bit different than, say, growing corn or wheat, grains and so forth. And you can't just like, if I go throw some apple seeds in the ground, that's not how people are growing apples today. Can you walk us through a little bit like how you actually cultivate a stable product? Because if I just throw seeds in the ground, you don't quite know what is actually going to grow, what kind of apple. So how does apple
Right.
growing and grafting, how does all that work?
So apples are heterozygous, which means that they're very highly genetically variable. So if you plant seeds, you're basically rolling the genetic dice. You don't know what you're going to get. Um, if you plant seeds from a red apple, you might end up with green apples. Various flavor profiles and sizes and colors and textures are going to come from that scattering of seeds. So the only way to propagate something that is identical to the tree you want is to graft it. And so you would cut off a slip of a branch and graft that onto a new rootstock to create a new tree. This is something people have been doing since ancient times. This is old technology, and this is how people in Europe propagated particular species of apples and then brought those to North America when they immigrated here. So you have to have that nursery stock. You have to have someone who can either provide that for you, or you need to have that skill set yourself to be able to graft those trees to propagate the particular type of apple that you want. So it does take a bit of skill.
And it takes like a lot of intentionality, I guess.
Yeah.
Like this isn't just something you can casually do. It takes a lot of very careful work, and the timeline is also it takes years.
Yeah. So from the time you plant that sapling, you're looking at 3 to 5 years before you have a fruit crop. So to your point, intentionality, you really are thinking a little bit long term. It's not like planting a crop of corn where you're going to, by that fall, be able to reap that harvest. You're thinking 3 to 5 years down the road. And so for early growers, that challenge was, how do I stay financially solvent in that time period while I'm waiting for these trees to produce? But then I think for the industry as a whole, it makes it challenging if we're thinking about at what point do we maybe want to change the variety that we're growing, or kind of rotate out some of the older trees in the orchard. That process of managing that is on a much different timeline.
And I mean, we'll get to this later, but this makes marketing more complicated,
Mhm.
uh, because if people's tastes, like nobody likes Red Delicious anymore, it's going to take the industry years to actually catch up and maybe start producing varieties that they do want. Or if suddenly there's a new variety that people are just bonkers about, you can't just start producing it tomorrow in large
Exactly.
number.
Exactly.
Yeah, this is just, I think, it's a very different kind of agricultural system and economic world than I think what a lot of people think of when they think agriculture. They think soybeans, corn, wheat out on the plains, right? Uh,
Mhm.
Not just today, but historically. But orchards and apple orchards are quite different. It's also unique in that when I go to the store, I guess there are varieties of peaches. There'd be white or yellow flesh peaches, but they're not branded with names like Red Delicious, Jonna Gold, like all these that we have with apples. I'm trying to think, is there another, I guess pears, there are a few kind of specific varieties, but there's not, and cherries, there's a few, but there's not many that,
Yeah, and I think that more speaks to the perishability of the crop, because there are all kinds different kinds of peaches. And if you go to your farmer's market, and if you're um, in a place where you have a farmer's market, you'll see there's different varieties. But a fruit like a peach is much more perishable. And so what you see in the grocery store is going to be a fairly limited season for fresh. And they are going to pick a very narrow variety because there's not that many that travel well and that will stand up to kind of the rigors of being shipped across country.
so that's
So,
maybe kind of the grocery store world where we're
yeah,
not
that's kind
seeing
of
the
the
variety.
grocery store
Yeah.
world. But that's also the reason that um, growers in central Washington were encouraged to plant apples, because when they started doing this in the early 1900s, apples were the fruit that was hardy enough that they could be put in storage. They would last several months. They could be shipped in iced refrigerated rail cars back east and make it to a market intact. And you couldn't do that with a peach or a plum or a cherry at that time.
Yeah, so it's specifically a crop that could, withstand long distance freight, which expands the geography of, I guess,
Mhm.
of your market, right? They're not growing just for a local market. That would not have been
Exactly.
economically viable, right? This was going to be
No.
a national crop. Yeah.
No, and I think, within the context of the Apple industry, this is happening all over the West at this same time period, where we see this development of commercial agriculture. It's not just Washington apples; it's California oranges and iceberg lettuce in California as well, sugar beets in southern Idaho, and potatoes in Idaho, um, where we have railroads and other economic interests encouraging people to grow these crops commercially, because now we have the technology to transport them to growing eastern cities, which are expanding greatly in the early 1900s, to feed those urban populations that are thousands of miles away from where the food is actually grown.
Let's talk about the railroads then, and this infrastructure. Apples come to Washington, in the mid 1800s. I think apocryphally, like up in Fort Vancouver, there's some
Mhm.
cute story about some Hudson's Bay Company guy like throwing some seeds and planting some seeds, and whether that's true or not, who knows. But in terms of it becoming an actual industry, what's the influence of railroads?
Enormous. So I think that's one of the things that we don't always appreciate as Western historians, how much influence the railroads actually have in every single Western industry. Because they're not only building the rail lines, they're looking for ways to monetize their assets and to profit from hauling things all along their lines. So I worked a lot with the records from the Northern Pacific Railroad and the Great Northern Railroad that are at the Minnesota Historical Society. It was fabulous. There's over 20,000 linear feet of materials in those collections. And the railroads were pretty meticulous record keepers. So often I had both sides of correspondence, which was fantastic. But if you look in their files, they had various departments dealing with timber and wheat and ranching and fisheries. Pick a Western industry, they had someone monitoring it, if not actively invested in it in some way. And so for both of these railroads, as they're looking at the territory in central Washington, knowing that this is land that's going to be irrigated, they were trying to promote a crop that would be the most profitable for their rail line in the long run. And apples is what they settled on. Folks could grow grain maybe, but Eastern Washington, the Palouse country, is some of the best wheat land in the world. And so you're not going to compete with that if you have the added cost of irrigation in your inputs. Economically, that just doesn't pencil out. Sugar beets were something they considered, but you need a lot of infrastructure to grow sugar beets. You need to
Processing them.
Processing, yeah. You've got to get them to the processing plant pretty quickly or they start turning to starch. And the railroads were invested in a lot of sugar beet stuff in southern Idaho already. So apples were the thing that they kind of lit upon as a crop that could be profitable within the kind of economic constraints of the region.
Yeah, so in a way they're creating, because they're going to make their money down the line on freight, right? Charging
Exactly.
for transport. So they're creating demand for their
Yes.
service.
Exactly.
And this is something that, anyone who's studied the West generally, I think, is familiar with, especially out on the plains. The railroads, they run the show. And late 19th century, they become the target of a lot of, rural anger, right, in the populist movement, because the railroads and the banks did have so much power.
Yeah.
But it's not just creating future demand for their freight services. The Great Northern, or the Northern Pacific, had land grants that they got from building. And some may be familiar. There's like kind of a checkerboard that would radiate out from a rail line that the Central and Union Pacific got, and then alternating plots were given to the railroad as an incentive, from the government to build, and then they could then sell that. So, but the Great Northern did not, correct?
No, they did not. But they were invested in some real estate ventures in central Washington. And they had purchased land in advance of the track being laid. And of course, they knew exactly where they were going to put their tracks. So they went in and purchased a bunch of land before the tracks were laid. And then once the tracks were down, they got the land cheap and then were able to then raise the price tremendously once there was transportation through the area.
People may wonder sometimes if they've seen some of these old, maybe I would call them propaganda advertisements, but this kind of boosterism, these advertisements and magazines and stuff, come move out to the plains or come move to Washington and, start a farm and whatnot. And then if you look at the fine print at the bottom, it's like the Union Pacific is the one putting these ads out, right? Because they had land they wanted to sell to these farmers who they would then later charge rates to then transport their crops, right?
Exactly.
So they're going to make money on kind of all ends of these deals.
Exactly.
Well, we're going to get to, I think, what you call hyper-industrialization, which is, the consolidation of small farms into bigger and bigger and bigger farms. Like that's nationwide, probably worldwide. That's a phenomenon. When we're saying that in the late 1800s, and this apple industry is getting established in Washington, what is the scale of these farms? And maybe we can get into a little bit of how the individualism of kind of small family-run orchards causes some problems in terms of cooperative ventures and things that they could have been doing.
The scale of these is pretty small at first, 10 to 20 acres. And it was kind of expected that these would be small family businesses. And that's how they were sold to individuals in these promotional brochures. Um, there was a lot of rhetoric about, getting away from the rat race of the city. So if you're an accountant or you're a teacher or a manager in a company and you're burned out, come out west, start your own small business growing apples. You can't fail. You'll be out in the fresh air and sunshine, and it will be good for your health, good for your family, and you can't lose. That's really the message. Um, the problem is that if you're attracting a middle class audience who has no background in agriculture, you can't expect that they're going to be successful growing apples, because it's as we talked about earlier, you have to have some level of knowledge for how to care for the trees. They don't just grow. You actually have to do a lot of work to prune them, to spray for insects. You have to irrigate, which adds another whole layer of complication to managing an orchard. And if you're someone who has no agricultural experience, this is a lot to learn and a lot to take on. And so I was never able to find statistics on how many people failed. The Washington historian John Fahey, in his book, estimated that it was about 75%. Unfortunately, that statistic was not well sourced in his book. And so I was never really able to track that down. But at least anecdotally, there were a number of people who moved to Central Washington and ended up, deciding they were going to open an insurance business or move on to Seattle or do something different because they found that growing apples was not the path to easy riches that they had been told it would be.
But many came with the idea that they were going to be doing it on their own. This was
Mhm.
their little kingdom.
Exactly.
How does that run counter to some of the needs of the broader industry in the late 19th century? There's some kind of cooperative, communal things that really need to be going on for this to work efficiently.
Having a small farm and being that independent works great when you have a nearby market and you can market your fruit directly close to home. But when we're talking about the scale of what was happening in Washington, where very quickly local markets are saturated. So by 1904, 1905, we're starting to see the first rail shipments out of the state. Those aren't just going to Seattle and Portland, they're going to Chicago and Boston and New York. If you're an individual person trying to run your whole 10-acre farm by yourself, you're not only dealing with the logistics of growing your crop, you now have to deal with the logistics of marketing your crop. And you may not have connections in Chicago to be able to sell your fruit. This is an era before chain grocery stores. And so typically how fruit brokering worked is there would be wholesalers in places like Chicago or New York who would purchase fruit from growers. And then those wholesalers would sell the shipment to mom and pop grocery stores and distribute it from there. So you needed a connection in the wholesale market. You had to trust that person and trust that that person was going to be honest with their accounting. And that was something that a lot of growers were frustrated by, because they would get these messages from wholesalers saying, well, I got your carload of apples, but they were all bruised and I couldn't sell them. Well, how do you know that they're telling the truth? And so that's kind of the sticking point in the system of being individual, because as an individual, there's no way you can manage this massive task of keeping an eye on markets, or knowing, well, maybe the prices are going to be better in Bismarck and I need to ship my apples there instead of shipping them to Chicago. How are you as an individual going to keep up with all of those changes?
So what kinds of organizations crop up then to serve some of these cooperative needs?
So we get cooperatives, various apple cooperatives that start where growers can pay a small fee, and the cooperative hires managers to deal with these larger marketing questions. Now, a lot of growers were reluctant to join cooperatives because it took away some of their autonomy, because the cooperative is then making the decision about where they're going to sell the fruit and at what point the price is optimal. And a cooperative might decide to sell, when they're getting, say, $1 a pound. And maybe next week they're $1.10 a pound, right? Growers would get upset by that. Like, why didn't you wait till it was $1.10? But the marketers are trying to look at the whole landscape and say, well, you can't predict, right? You can't predict from week to week if prices are going to go up or go down. You got to jump in when it's a good point. So those kinds of frustrations of losing that control, but at the same time, as an individual, they realistically couldn't manage the marketing on their own.
And this is where we also then start to get the actual marketing of like a Washington apple as like a brand of sorts, right? It's from these cooperatives and these professional marketers.
Yeah, and these professional marketers are creating brands. At one point, there were over 230 brands of apples coming out of Washington. And that was also a point of tension because growers wanted to put their own individual labels for their orchards. They didn't want that overtaken by the cooperative name. So some cooperatives compromised and would have a little space for the grower to put their label within the bigger cooperative label. But those brands did start to carry some weight with wholesalers back east who would recognize this is a quality brand. I can trust the produce I'm getting from this place. In fact, I came across one account of a grower who put the cooperative labels on the inside of his apple crate and his own on the outside. And when that shipment arrived at the wholesaler sent a really nasty telegram back to the cooperative saying, "Hey, we wanted your brand of apples. You didn't send them to us." And it turned out it was just the way the labeling was. But wholesalers really, really did kind of come to trust the quality of certain brands.
This can get us a little bit into some of the other things that cooperative efforts provided. We need to get into like the Great Depression era and so forth, but there's a lot of concern about pests. I remember when I was a kid, whenever we'd drive down to Seattle and get on, I think it was like the 405, there's this one underpass you'd go through and there was a sign that said, "Now entering the apple maggot quarantine." And as, kids, we thought that was funny for some reason, like maggots. But I'd be like, oh, so like there's this concern, or like whenever we go to Canada, do you have any fruits or vegetables in your car? They would always ask you. That's because they're concerned about about pests, certain worms and moths and apple maggots, apparently.
Yeah.
How does the cooperative world help with that, or why is that so important? That there's someone kind of overseeing pest control and then the application of pesticides and chemicals and so forth.
So that was actually written into state law from Washington statehood that if you had a commercial orchard, you had to spray for pests. So the state had county horticultural agents that would come around and check to make sure folks had actually applied their sprays appropriately. For cooperatives, where this could really help growers was bulk purchasing and getting them a lower price on supplies that they needed for the orchard because of being able to buy in bulk. That was the real benefit.
And the problem being that so who cares if I get a bunch of worms in my apples? Like, that's my loss, right? But my neighbor's going to get them also.
Exactly.
Right? It's kind of like a vaccine herd immunity type concept, maybe.
Yeah. And this goes really counter to that idea of individuality that we were talking about, where you're supposed to be the, king of your own little domain here, your own small business. But yet there's all these regulations and all these things that you have to do that are mandated by state law, by pressure from your neighbors who don't want their orchards to get infected. And so suddenly this independence that you thought you had is now constrained.
The industry grows dramatically by the 1900s and teens. It's starting to dominate the national market. And then comes some dry years, some drought years in the 20s, and then the Great Depression, which follows in the 30s. And that impacts apple growers in, I think, some unanticipated ways that people might not think about. People might just assume it was really dry, which it was, and lots of them went out of business because the irrigation wasn't sufficient or whatnot. But there's all kinds of other ramifications people might not think about, with banking, with all kinds of other things. Walk us through what the Great Depression does to the Apple industry, and then eventually we'll kind of get to the World War II era, and that does other new things. Then we can go on from there.
So for Washington, the real issue was financial because growers need a lot of upfront capital. And this is true in a lot of agriculture. You need that upfront capital in the spring when you're putting in your crop so that you can buy your pesticides and you can pay the guy to come help prune your trees and all the things that you need to do to maintain your orchard. And so it was very typical for growers to take out loans each spring, and then they would pay them back in the fall when the crop came in. There were several bank failures in central Washington, which limited the number of institutions that growers could seek loans from. And in 1932, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which was approved by Herbert Hoover, had promised funds. The whole point of the Reconstruction Finance Corporation was to try to help industry and give loans to industry with the idea that this would help jumpstart the economy. But the hoops that one had to jump through to get that money were prohibitive. And so in that 1932 season, especially, growers couldn't get the funds that they needed to do the spraying and do the things that they needed to keep orchards healthy. Ultimately, what had to happen was under the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, growers had to set up their own credit union, essentially, but they needed money to back that. And so the railroad stepped in with an influx of cash to back those credit unions so that they could get funds from the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. And so the railroads essentially became the bankers for much of the 30s.
But it was in their interest as well, like, because they wanted them to ship their apples on their railways, right?
Yeah, it was in their interest as well, because they did want those shipments. And of course, the problem is, as we just mentioned, if you skip spraying your orchard, you're going to get those worms. That's going to hurt your orchard. That's going to hurt your neighbors. But also, if you're not keeping up with orchard maintenance, that's going to hurt the long-term productivity of your orchard as well. And so delaying these things is not just a problem for 1 year, it's a problem for the future. So the railroads very reluctantly took on these credit corporations, pumped in quite a bit of cash that they never recovered. And they were very reluctant to do so, but did so knowing that they needed the profits from the industry. But by the late 30s, the relationship between railroads and the industry had very much soured because of these bad debts.
What about some of the other New Deal initiatives like research stations in Washington? How does the influx of scientific study and research in agriculture, funded and supported by the government and by land grant colleges, like Washington State, where you did your graduate work and so forth? How does that impact the apple industry in Washington during the Great Depression?
So the state colleges were always instrumental in doing research, but they're located in Pullman, which is on the eastern side of the state. And growers had always complained that the research being done in Pullman didn't necessarily reflect the microclimates that exist in central Washington where apples are grown. And so they had long been petitioning for a research station to be located in central Washington where that work could be done. And in 1937, the state finally appropriated funds for a research station in Wenatchee to be run by Washington State College to actually do that research in central Washington, near growers in that specific climate. And that's something that came out, as you mentioned, out of the Depression, out of that need to say, okay, what can we do to help the industry and help it flourish in this time when it's really struggling?
So what does the station do, and how do growers then benefit from it?
Oh, they do all kinds of research. A lot of research on pesticides, on pest control. They still exist today. They do research on different varieties of fruit. One of the big ones recently was, of course, the Cosmic Crisp apple that came out a few years ago. It was a product of that program. helping to find which varieties are going to be best suited for our local climate, um, pest control, what's the most efficient way to prune your orchard, everything dealing with growing of and marketing of fruit are questions that they dive into.
And is this also the era when we get the statewide like marketing commission,
The
like as a
same
state
year,
agency?
the same year in 1937, we get a statewide marketing agency as well. And that's something that growers had been talking about again for many years, but could never get consensus um, and get the buy-in from enough people to make that happen. And with the economic downturn of the Depression, they finally got enough people to say, yeah, this is a good idea. We could use a state agency to help us coordinate marketing efforts.
And this is where, you get all kinds of branding and marketing and an apple a day keeps the doctor away. I mean, the same thing happened with Florida oranges. That was a huge, that was a marketing campaign.
Yeah.
And suddenly we all have orange juice at breakfast because the marketing told us that's what we should do. Like, this is, again, something that individual growers weren't going to be able to do on their small individual scale.
And again, thinking of the broader West, growers are looking at the California Fruit Exchange, for example, that had the Sunkist brand, and looking to groups like that and saying, look at the success they're having with their brand and their state efforts. We need to bring those things to Washington and replicate that.
What happens during World War II with all the economic, kind of turmoil and not necessarily bigger demand, but different demands for agricultural products, right? The Army would, requisition the best apples to send to the troops and so forth. What does that do to the apple industry?
I mean, on the one hand, the Army requisitions, the Army contracts are a big boon. At the same time, labor is a big problem, often finding enough people to actually bring in the crop. So during the war, they would often close school, have high school students out in the fields picking. Towns in central Washington would actually close businesses on certain days so that everyone could go out and pick. They bust in a bunch of students from area, from the West Side, from Seattle in some cases, to help pick for a weekend. Pretty much anything like that they could do to get the crop brought in. But as you mentioned, the best apples were going to the military because the Army felt that for the troops, having an apple would be a reminder of home, and that would be something that would boost morale, which left civilian consumers with the dregs.
With those Red Deliciouses?
With those Red Delicious. And Red Deliciouses are a fine apple, but if they're not stored properly, then they can have that problem with going a little mealy. And that was the problem that they were facing. The Red Deliciouses were kind of the ones left in the market, and they weren't always being shipped properly or stored properly. And so what consumers were getting on their end was not a great product.
And that's not good for the state brand.
Not at all.
So it's going to need some rehabilitation post-war.
Yeah. And they did a lot of rehabilitation post-war. In fact, the big campaign they did immediately after the war was Don't Be a Bruiser. And it was really aimed at grocery store owners, trying to educate them about how they needed to handle apples so not to damage them.
And the last, 50, 70 years since World War II, you write in your last chapter about consolidation and hyper-industrialization and some new technologies and growing techniques. How has this industry evolved over the past half century or so?
So in some ways, a lot of the concerns are the same. We still have the concerns about the pests. We still have the long-distance marketing questions. A lot of that hasn't changed. What has changed is technology. Root stocks have gotten smaller. So historically, when the industry started, they planted about 40 trees per acre. Now, with the smaller rootstocks, they can get between 800 and 1,000 trees per acre.
Yeah, if you drive by one of these orchards, it doesn't look like what you think an apple or like here where I live in Utah, there's an apple orchard, I don't know, less than a quarter mile from our house in the middle of the suburbs, right? And it's pretty normal looking kind of round trees. You drive through central Washington and you have these Tatura, I think I don't know if it was the brand or just the style, but these like V-shaped trellises that look like viticulture. It looks more like grapes.
Ah.
Can you explain kind of what that looks like and how that allows them to pack more into each acre?
Yeah, so the trees are very small. I mean, you drive by them and you wouldn't think that they could support all the weight that they do. But the trees themselves are very small and they are trellised up on these wire trellises that help support the weight of the fruit. And then they're planted in rows that when they do go down and pick them, it kind of keeps the fruit out toward the inside of the row so that they can pick much more easily. The trees are much shorter than they were historically as well. And the other benefit of the trellis systems is that they can also put netting over the fruit, which s- is partly a pest control measure, but also if it gets too hot, they sometimes need to shade the trees. So the netting kind of serves that dual purpose. Um, it's nothing like the kind of idyllic orchard that people might imagine. It looks much more like a grape um, vineyard.
Yeah, this is kind of that hyper industrialization you're talking about, right? This move, it's not just small family farms with a cute orchard in the back 10 or 20 acres. These are larger and larger conglomerates, um, and the labor force is different also. These aren't necessarily just family businesses. Lots
Yeah.
of migrant labor. I mean, the Yakima Valley. I don't know. I mean, I don't know all the exact demographic data, but the percentage of like Spanish speaking population from
hmm
now generations of migrant labor is incredibly high,
Yeah,
right?
very high. I don't know those numbers off the top of my head either, but incredibly high. The other thing they're experimenting with, and I don't know if it will come to fruition or not, is robotic harvesting. And that was something I saw during the pandemic. There was some early experiments that in New Zealand and Washington with robotic harvesters, um, because it's such a seasonal need that this as the industry has grown, this has always been a challenge. How do you get workers for that small window when you need them?
So if we zoom out kind of to the west broadly and to try to wrap things up here a bit, for those of us who don't live in Washington, who maybe hate apples, who don't care about agriculture, I don't know, like why should we care about this? What does this tell us about broader? I mean, because a lot of this is we've been very, very specific in all our discussion about apples, apples, apples in Washington. But what are some broader lessons or themes or things that you think come out of your work that could inform how we think about the rest of the region or other industries?
I think this is just kind of one example of how the entire food system was changing. It's not just Washington apples, it's a host of other crops that are being industrialized in this way around the same time. And so, as Americans, if we think about how we're eating, how folks were eating in 1900, where it was very seasonal, um, you wouldn't have fresh fruit all year round. It would be certain times of year to a point now where you're buying watermelons in February. This is
Yeah.
part of that story and part of that broader change um, in how we eat and how we get food on our plates. In fact, I found it was from the early 1920s in a fruit packer journal, someone complaining, longing for the old days when consumers were happy with some shriveled up turnips in February. And now, because of these Western growers, everyone wants fresh, nice looking fruit year round. So that's a pretty big change that affects all of us, whether we realize it or not.
It's good to know where our food comes from also. We don't quite understand kind of the global, I mean, yeah, literally often not just regional or national, but global and hemispheric scale of what's going into it and who's growing it and how it's getting here. And, these are big, complicated networks. I really appreciate how your book really underscores that this didn't just happen by accident. It wasn't even necessarily like a natural, organic process in which this industry grew because Washington was destined to be apple country. This was manufactured with a stop and start, and successes and failures, but a lot of work went into making this be a thing. Um, I
Yeah,
like that reading that contingency back into history and learning like, oh, it could have gone other ways.
it could have. And, apples were tried in a lot of places in the West. A lot of crops were experimented in across the West as irrigation systems were being built. And in some cases, the environment was not conducive and it didn't work out. But people were trying a lot of things in a lot of places.
Congrats again on the book. I know it's been out for a couple years, but I hope you're still kind of basking in the glow of, finally getting the project out there. It's really great, and yeah, I really appreciate you taking a few minutes to talk with us this month.
Yeah, thanks for chatting.
All right, I hope we'll cross paths soon sometime.
Yeah, definitely.
All right, thanks, Amanda.
Yeah, have a great day.
Thanks for listening. I hope you'll subscribe and listen every month. Please leave us a review on whatever app or platform you're listening through, and follow us on Facebook at Writing Westward Podcast or on X or Twitter at Writing West. There you can get updates and leave comments and share episodes with your friends, family, and colleagues. Writing Westward is supported by the Charles Redd Center for Western Studies at Brigham Young University. We are an interdisciplinary research center that supports academic and public research and promotion of public understanding of the North American West. We host regular public lectures, which we live stream on our YouTube and Facebook pages, have an annual funding cycle with award, grant, and fellowship categories that nearly anyone can apply for if they are researching or working on the region from any disciplinary approach or towards any final product. Learn more at reddcenter.byu.edu. That's REDD Center. Our theme music was provided by local Utah composer Micah Dahl Anderson. His website is also linked in the show notes. As you know by now, my name is Brendan Rensing, and since I serve as the podcast host, producer, sound engineer, publicist, and everything else for the podcast, you can direct praise or critique my work. As a historian, I'm the author and editor of a number of books, articles, and chapters on the North American West, borderlands, Native peoples, genocide studies, religion, the environment, and other topics. My most prominent publications include a 2018 book, Native but Foreign, Indigenous Immigrants and Refugees in North American Borderlands, which won the Best Historical Nonfiction Book Award from the Western Writers of America, a 2019 anthology I co-edited with P. Jane Hafen, Essays on American Indian and Mormon History, which won the Metcalf Best Anthology Book Prize from the John Whitmer Historical Association, and a 2022 collection of essays I edited entitled The North American West in the 21st Century. I also recently launched and will be editing a new series for the University of New Mexico Press entitled Histories of the North American West. So send me a note if you have a manuscript to propose for publication. Here at the Redd Center, I'm also general editor and project manager of a great digital public history project, Intermountain Histories. It's a free mobile app and website that curates student-researched and written micro-histories of the region, complete with archival photos, bibliographies, and more. To contact me about that project, the podcast, my own research, or anything else, head to bwrensink, that's bwrensink.org. Email me at bwrensink@byu.edu, or follow me on X Twitter at Brendan W. Rensink. Until next month, be well.